You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the Unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristen Dilly.
My name is Kristen Dilly. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristen Dilly.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And this is our first episode of Season 2 of Mind Over Murder, where we feature the Colonial Parkway Murders.
Yeah, this is an exciting time. The show has run, at least for its first time, and we're hoping that many of you have seen it. One thing we're determined to do, if we can, is discuss the show a little bit, but not have any spoilers appear in this podcast, because we recognize that not everybody will have seen the show yet. So we're not going to ruin it for you.
And we realize that there are a lot of people, because you have told us so via social media, who do not have access to Oxygen, the cable channel. Neither do I. I actually had to watch it this morning by going to the Oxygen website. So we do want to encourage you that if you do not have access to the Oxygen cable channel, to use one of the alternate ways of watching the series. So you can go to oxygen.com. So right to their website. I actually watched this morning on a laptop. When you go to the Oxygen website, you'll see shows. Click on Lovers Lane Murders, and you'll see episodes. Click on episodes, and you'll have a nice little set of thumbnails laid out for each episode 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we do encourage you to start at the beginning, because it's only going to make sense that way. And enjoy the episodes right there on the Oxygen website for free.
Real important. The show has run now on Thursday, February 11th and Friday, February 12th in two-hour specials. But you can figure out pretty quickly when you watch the show is set up as 4 separate episodes, 1, 2, 3, 4. And as Kristen says, it makes sense to watch them in order because they reference back to, when you get to the second case and the third case and so on, they reference back to potential links, similarities, that kind of thing with the earlier cases. So feel free to jump around if you want, but the show is meant to be watched 1, 2, 3, 4, at least initially. The show is available in the United States and in many other territories on the Oxygen cable and satellite networks. As Kristen says, it's available via the app, which then extends the territory. We recognize that we have friends around the world, and some listeners to this podcast may still not be able to access it. Don't forget, Oxygen is an NBC Universal company, so you might want to check your local listings. You're looking for Lovers Lane Murders, the actual name of the show. And we hope that over time, everybody around the world will be able to see the show, and we'd very much like that.
It is also our understanding, based on Oxygen's own webpage, that you can get episodes from Amazon or on iTunes. So if you can't find it on the Oxygen website, do give one of those two venues a try.
Now, over the next couple of weeks, then, as we start to talk about the Colonial Parkway Murders and this show, we will do more research and double check. And if we find available platforms have now added Lovers Lane Murders, we'll certainly let you know. We'll also include in the show notes for this week's episode, and probably several weeks to come, more information as we discover it. In other words, here's another optional way for you to enjoy Lovers Lane Murders.
Exactly. And if you are one of our friends from overseas and you find a way to watch Lovers Lane Murders, please let us know so that we can provide that information going forward.
Now, I talked to our friends at Oxygen the other day, and I asked them, are they going to break the show back down into its component parts, the episodes 1, 2, 3, and 4? And the answer was yes. So in the coming weeks now, and I don't know if you know anything about cable television, but I worked in the television business for a number of years. They tend to repeat shows a lot. So Lovers Lane Murders will show up again and again, and hopefully again after that. So hopefully you'll have a chance to watch the show, and maybe even more than once. We recorded the thing to our DVR, so we'll probably watch it several times. And I had actually seen the show several times when it was in its development. Hopefully there will be opportunities. We know some folks have been a little frustrated because they were excited about the show and then they were having some difficulty. So we're going to try to make that easier for you. We promise.
Absolutely. So at this point, Bill and I have seen the show, and we hope that most of you all have too. And if you haven't, we hope you get a chance to watch it. But we wanted to fill you in on a little backstory, a little inside baseball about how this whole series at Oxygen came to be. So if you'll sit back and relax for a couple of minutes, we've got our origin story to fill you in on.
Do you feel like we should be sitting around a campfire or something at this point?
Something like that, yeah.
Okay. So for those of you that are somewhat familiar with the Colonial Parkway murders, obviously the case stretches from 1986 to 1989. And we'll do a deep dive on individual aspects of the case and so on in future episodes. There were television shows that covered the Colonial Parkway murders as a news item, of course, right from the very beginning from 1986 to 1989. And so there was a lot of local news coverage. Those of you that have seen the show, Andy Fox, who's a longtime reporter for WAVY, which is the NBC affiliate in Norfolk, Virginia, appears in the show back in 86, covering the case. He had just joined the on-air team at WAVY. And then WTKR, which is the CBS affiliate, and WVEC, which is the ABC affiliate. And Wavy also doubles as a Fox outlet as well, and I'm not 100% sure how that works, but
yeah, me either.
They are both in that market. I have no idea. The cases were covered as a local and regional and sometimes national news story. And it's not till 1996, 10 years after the first of the Colonial Parkway murders, that a national television show covered the Colonial Parkway murders. You got to remember, we're all living in a time where true crime is incredibly popular, hence you're listening to this podcast, and true crime on television is incredibly popular, hence Investigation Discovery and Oxygen and all the shows you see on Amazon and Netflix. And we are in a time now where there is a great deal of true crime content. This was not true 20 or 30 years ago. So the first show that nationally covered the Colonial Parkway murders was actually called Real Stories of the Highway Patrol. I
remember that.
Even the name actually kind of sounds like a throwback.
I remember that really well.
And that was in 1996, and they did a story on the Colonial Parkway murders. Now, some of these are hard to find, and I might have seen them back in the day, but I've never seen them again. You actually have to flash forward again almost another 10 years to 2007. A show called Sensing Murder covered the Colonial Parkway murders.
Haven't heard of that one.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think it's Sensing Murder. We'll have to talk to Joyce Call Canada, Keith's sister. I think her recollection, that show focuses on psychics and their reactions to what had happened on the Colonial Parkway murders and their observations. And then in 2008, E! Entertainment did a show called Serial Killers on the Loose, and they had a segment all about the Colonial Parkway murders. So it's really not until 2013 that a show called Dark Minds on Investigation Discovery covered the Colonial Parkway murders in more of an in-depth fashion. Now, at this point, what's that? 8 years ago now? 8 years ago? M. William Phelps, who's a really wonderful guy, who's a longtime true crime writer himself, written a number of bestsellers all about true crime. He lost his sister-in-law to violent crime. which is how he came to the space. And it's interesting, Kristen has a history with losing a friend's mother. And of course, I lost my sister Kathy in the Colonial Parkway murders. We're not implying that everyone that works in the true crime space has necessarily been touched by violent crime, but it sure seems to be common. In 2013, Dark Minds did a television show, and we'll include links in the show notes. I actually thought that was extremely well done.
Yeah, it was. I really enjoyed it.
Now, that show has some elements of reenactment, which are something that, as the brother of a murder victim, I get a little uncomfortable with sometimes because It feels a little close for me. For other people, it might be fine. And the one thing, and Kristen and you and I have talked about this, when you're trying to show people what happened, the reenactment approach does make some sense.
Sure, absolutely it does. But it can definitely get uncomfortable, I would imagine, as someone who has been touched by violent crime, to see that playing out. I know that you did spend some time on the set when the reenactments were being done for Lover's Lane murders. I remember wondering if you were going to be okay during that particular day, because I don't know if I would have handled it with nearly the kind of like grace and aplomb that you did. You did very, very well in a way that I don't think I could have.
Well, thanks. I mean, it's funny. I had a job to do, which we'll get into in a minute. But yeah, there were moments it can be uncomfortable. Now, in the Dark Minds series, M. William Phelps and a television crew came to my apartment, my condo in West Hollywood. And I remember they completely tore the place apart. They put it all back together, but I felt like they moved every stick of furniture. It was all about, the right angle and controlling the light. And they were there during the day, but they wanted the place to be completely dark so that they could control the light. So they weren't crazy about like the sunlight streaming through the windows, and they were concerned about the potential was there for noise because my condo looked out on a shared swimming pool that was in kind of a rectangular space in the center of the building, and it could get a little echoey in there. Mm-hmm. So if somebody was down below swimming or talking or whatever, they were concerned about that. So it's all about, they want to control the environment from a light and sound perspective. And then remember, they were trying to get the longest possible shot of me sitting at my dining room table, which meant they kept backing up further and further and further into the far corner of the living room and moving the table in the dining room further and further into the corner. And it was like, okay, guys, whatever. And then, going into my closet, because they said, they were done moving furniture and it was time to put on a shirt that I was going to wear to interview. And so I had this walk-in closet, and at this point I was living alone. But I remember somebody from the crew came in and I had this very unusual experience of, somebody I didn't know particularly well coming in and choosing my outfit for me. And, it's the kind of thing where, maybe a girlfriend might have said, oh, I think you should wear that shirt. It matches your eyes or something like that. Or that would look nice when we go out for a fancy dinner. But that's usually somebody, you're dating or whatever. And this was like a kind of sort of not somebody I knew particularly well saying, here, let's go into your closet and take a look and we'll pick something out that's flattering. And it was just a little bit weird. It went really well. I think the show is extremely well done. That show has a little bit of an affectation. It ran for several years. It was pretty successful. Not every show lasts forever. That show has a little bit of an affectation because they talk to a serial killer, a real serial killer who's behind bars, and they obscure his identity. I think they call him the Raven or something.
They call him the Raven, yeah.
And so they talk to the Raven and they use this weird distorted thing, so you can't recognize his voice. And he doesn't appear on camera. I don't know what they put up when they show the Raven, but they describe the situation to this guy, and then he talks about what a murderer might get out of a particular situation. His observations are actually pretty interesting, and the truth is, most of us don't have any firsthand knowledge about how killers go about killing people, thankfully. It was interesting. As the last few years have moved forward and the Colonial Parkway Murders families were working together to continue to shine a media spotlight on the case. So you've got the 8 families, and we're all trying to coordinate strategy. This is in the post-2009 and forward time frame. This is after the crime scene photos had been leaked by the FBI, and my family and other families began working together. The Call and Haley families had done a tremendous amount of work in trying to keep the story of the Colonial Parkway murders and their loved ones' loss. You're talking about Keith Call and Cassandra Haley specifically, and had worked with other families from the Colonial Parkway case and other cases. It was something that we always wanted, was to do a full-length show or series about the Colonial Parkway murders.
I know that based on some of the reporting material that I have, courtesy of Joyce Call's father, who kept an extensive library of every newspaper article that came out regarding the case. I know that there was a push for a while to try to get Unsolved Mysteries interested in the case. I think it would actually still be pretty cool considering the new rebooted version of Unsolved Mysteries. That might be kind of a cool thing.
Yes.
I think that would be wonderful, especially with the new format that they've got. For anybody who hasn't seen the new Unsolved Mysteries, it's not short little chunks where you get 5 or 6 different stories, but it is usually one long episode for one disappearance or murder or what have you. I think that would be great for us. So if you're working for Unsolved Mysteries and you're listening out there to our podcast, give us a call.
Yeah.
We'd love to take your call.
Well, and Unsolved Mysteries, I love the reboot. I think it's fantastic. Mm-hmm. It's also worth mentioning, too, that back in that 2009, 2010 timeframe, America's Most Wanted was still on the air. We very much wanted to do America's Most Wanted, and Sherry Cottle Nolan was the missing persons producer at America's Most Wanted. And in the Small World department, when I met Sherry in Washington, D.C., this is about 10 or more years ago, I went to meet with her in Virginia at their offices. They were very interested. And then I had the good fortune to meet John Walsh around that time at an industry function. I was working for SAG-AFTRA back then, and I was introduced to John Walsh at an event. And he knew who I was, and he knew a little bit about the Colonial Parkway murders. And one of the things that Mr. Walsh said to me, John Walsh is a super nice guy, and you may remember he got involved in America's Most Wanted because they had lost their son, Adam. He had been kidnapped and murdered at a Florida
shopping mall, yeah.
Right, shopping mall. And something that he said to me at the time when we spoke was, he said, Bill, the more I learn about your sister's case, meaning the Colonial Parkway murders, the more it sounds like Adam's case. He said, with the problems and the lack of coordination between the agencies and the discarded evidence and so on. So we kind of had this connection. Mm-hmm. Sadly, though, America's Most Wanted was very excited about covering the Colonial Parkway murders. But America's Most Wanted at that time couldn't move forward if they didn't have cooperation from law enforcement. And wouldn't you know it, we were very excited as a group of families because we thought that America's Most Wanted could be very helpful to moving the Colonial Parkway murders forward. And the FBI and the Virginia State Police wouldn't cooperate. So they turned us down. And America's Most Wanted said, we're really sorry, folks. We can't move forward without their say-so. So the idea went away. We also ran into something back then quite a bit. And I'm not placing blame here, but we were talking with shows like Dateline and 48 Hours and 2020, who have done a fair amount of crime. At the time, they were not terribly comfortable with cases that didn't have a resolution. And much in the same way when I was working on the manuscript for a book I hope to put out about the Colonial Parkway murders at some point, much in the same way where publishers said, well, Bill, this book would be a lot stronger if it had a happy ending. And they actually said that. Now, I'm not saying that the folks at 2020 or 48 Hours or Dateline said something quite so insensitive. But at the time, this is a decade or more ago, they would say, well, this would be a lot stronger if there was a resolution, an arrest, a positive development at the end. And of course, we didn't and still don't have that. So we got turned down by some folks. They were nice about it. Don't misunderstand me. But they couldn't see their way clear at that time to covering the Colonial Parkway murders. And so we dropped it.
I think it's important, too, to acknowledge we always have people who have asked us, well, can you guys do something with Cold Justice, with Kelly, Siegler and Steve Spingola? Can you do something with C.C. Moore? Can you do something with various other types of shows? And believe me, we would love that. But the reason we can't do Cold Justice is because the case is not considered a cold case. The case is still considered open and active by the law enforcement agencies working on it. So that's why we can't go that route. And as to the DNA, and we are going to do a whole episode on DNA and what there is and what there isn't, we do not have that evidence available to us. That does require cooperation, as Bill said, from the FBI, the Virginia State Police, and as family members and as advocates, we do not have any of that available to us. We really appreciate every time someone says, can't you do this show or that show? We want to. Very, very much, but there are a number of reasons why we can't. For anybody who has been wondering, that is our answer on that end.
Yeah, I forgot. We talked to Cold Justice, and they were extremely gracious. They're wonderful people. But if you watch Cold Justice carefully, those cases are what they call fully adjudicated. That means there's been an indictment, an arrest, a trial, a conviction. It's survived appeal, and then the individual or individuals responsible for the crime have been put away. So they actually don't tell you a story until it's been through the whole legal process. And we're not there in the Colonial Parkway murders. Not one of the 4 double homicides has ever moved forward through those phases. Whether this is a case where all of our elements are related or not remains to be seen. And this is something that I think they explore pretty interestingly on Lover's Lane. But a show like Cold Justice is built around the fact that the show only covers cases that are fully adjudicated. You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after these messages.
Do you like our show, Mind Over Murder, and want to create your own podcast?
Well then, let us tell you about Anchor.
First of all, it's free. And who doesn't love free, right?
I like free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer.
You can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before.
Anchor will then distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more platforms.
And you can even make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership.
I like the sound of that. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Right here, Anchor.
Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started on your own podcast.
You can tell them Kristen and Bill from Mind Over Murder sent you. One of the most frequent questions we're asked here at Mind Over Murder is, how can I help?
Thanks to Othram, a leading forensic DNA testing lab for law enforcement, you can get involved and help solve real cases.
If you have tested at a consumer genetics company, you can contribute your data to DNAsolves.com. The process is easy and confidential. Just 2 simple steps. Your DNA might be the missing piece that helps solve the identity of an unknown person.
Then Mind Over Murder will highlight cases Othram is working on to seek your crowdfunding support for DNA testing to help solve these cold cases.
Upload your DNA profile to DNAsolves.com. It's easy, free, and confidential.
Then join Mind Over Murder as we help families find answers with Othram and DNAsolves.com.
Welcome back to Mind Over Murder. The way Lover's Lane Murders comes about, and the title comes up later, is I think it's 4 years ago, after Victoria Hester and Blaine Pardoe's book, A Special Kind of Evil, had come out. I thought it might be time for us to really kind of focus on seeing if we could create a television series to tell the story of the Colonial Parkway murders. Keeping in mind, of course, we haven't identified a suspect or suspects, and obviously nothing has moved into a court of law. So we actually have some degree of sensitivity in terms of where we find ourselves in a case like ours. I had been introduced to Jim Clemente, who's a wonderful former FBI profiler. He shows up in the show. He's very central to helping advance the conversation of what happened in the Colonial Parkway murders. Jim has retired from the FBI, and keep in mind, you retire from law enforcement. You're still relatively a young person. So Jim now is very busy with a company that he and his brother Tim co-own called XG Productions, as in former XG men. Mm-hmm. Tim Clemente was an FBI agent, and Jim Clemente was an FBI profiler, and they worked together on some high-profile cases, including the D.C. sniper case, which many people have credited their partnership as brothers and FBI teammates to helping solve. I had been introduced to Jim, and so our show really starts in Jim Clemente's living room. He said, "Why don't you come over and meet with me and his partner from Real Crime Profile, the podcast, which is quite popular." I met with Laura Richards and Jim Clemente over takeout barbecue, which was delicious, I remember, in front of the fireplace in Jim's very cool kind of mid-century modern home in Los Angeles. And there were a couple of other friends that sort of were in and out. One of the producers from XG was there as well. But the conversation mostly centered around the three of us, Jim Clemente, Laura Richards, and myself, kind of brainstorming about putting a show together. And Jim talked about a lot of the things that I just mentioned, the sensitivity around unsolved cases. Some networks didn't want to take on a show where there wasn't a resolution, a happy ending. I'm not trying to be flip, but these are the things that people had said to us. So it was a really, really great conversation. And then it's funny, I think Jim and I got so into it, we kind of wore everybody else out, like one by one. Laura had to work the next day, and so she ended up saying goodnight to us and spinning off. And the several other people that were there, one by one, they said goodnight. And so Jim and I ended up sitting in front of the fireplace, talking really late. It was way past midnight by the time we finished up. But we got really into this whole conversation about how could we move a television series like this forward. Jim Clemente was a writer-producer on Criminal Minds at that time. He was incredibly busy. Kristen's getting all jazzed because she's a major Criminal Minds fan.
Major Criminal Minds fan, major Jim Clemente fangirl. Yep. Acknowledged.
All true. It took a while then for us to find time to move the ball forward. Now, by this point, I think you and I were working together in terms of victims advocacy, yes?
Yes, I do remember, because I remember having a conversation, and you were talking and said, I had a conversation with Jim Clemente the other day, and I had a minor freak out. You said about a TV series. Wouldn't that be something if that actually came to fruition? But knowing you, I was like, well, of course it's going to come to fruition. Bill's a stubborn Irishman. He's going to make it happen one way or the other. But yeah, we were working together at that point. If this was 4 years ago, I think we'd been working for about 2 years together doing victims advocacy. And I was still, really learning my way around the case. And I do remember having a conversation where you said you'd met with Jim, you talked about a TV series, and we were like, oh, this would be great. This would be so great. Imagine imagine, if you will, listeners, how great it feels to be 4 years later and finally seeing this come to fruition. This is enormous.
Well,
this is so cool.
And I'm not an experienced television producer, and I wear the hat of consulting producer, which we'll talk about in a second. We'll explain what that is. My understanding from people that have been doing this a lot longer is it doesn't normally take 4 years
right.
to get a show from Jim Clementi's living room over barbecue to being on the air at Oxygen. We hit some snags along the way, and the production got sped up and slowed down. And believe it or not, the COVID pandemic actually probably entered into the delay in terms of getting this show on the air. So the whole thing has taken a lot longer than any of us anticipated. Without getting into all those details, which are probably way too inside baseball for most folks, XG Productions initially started what they call the development process, which is putting together an outline of how the story would go. And I was brainstorming with them about who might appear on the show, what family members, investigators, journalists, all those sorts of things might be able to make contributions to the show in terms of background or appearing on camera for interviews and that kind of thing. XG was producing the show, and then ultimately a second television production company called Texas Crew Productions out of Austin, Texas, joined XG Productions, who were Los Angeles based. And so the show ended up being a co-production of XG Productions and Texas Crew Productions. And if you watch the show all the way out to the end, when the credits roll, you see a bunch of executive producers. Those are the folks that are actually overseeing the production, who are the people that kind of determine the creative decisions, like who's going to appear on camera. Or they say, oh, let's have Kristen Dilly appear on the show, which is something that developed while we were in Virginia shooting the show.
Yeah, it was so weird to get a phone call from Bill saying, do you want to actually be on the show? Is it a thing you want to do? And I'm very much a behind the scenes type person. The years that I worked in theater, I was a stage manager. I was never an actress. I didn't want to be an actress. I don't want people looking at me, which is why I do podcasting. It is very, very much it was kind of crazy for me to imagine, okay, let me, I guess, have a makeup artist work with me and put me on camera, I guess. Okay. But it was a lot of fun. And I'm very thankful that I got to appear on it, because it was a lot of fun. And I feel very gratified to have been able to work with this really excellent team of people. This is definitely an experience that I will not forget. I don't think any of us will forget it. It was a great treat. So yeah, that was a lot of fun. Now, Bill, you got to wear your consulting producer hat.
Right.
And can you tell people who are not familiar with television what a consulting producer actually does?
Okay. So a consulting producer is the subject matter expert. I mean, the sense is that supposedly outside of law enforcement, I'm supposed to be the greatest expert on this Colonial Parkway Murders case. Now, remember, there's lots of people, family members, investigators, journalists, and so on, who've worked on this case that know a tremendous amount about it. But remember, like the FBI and the Virginia State Police were not necessarily going to offer their current agents, who are incredibly knowledgeable about the case, they're not necessarily going to talk about an unsolved case on camera for a show like this. At least that's their point of view. So my job is to try to provide sort of a factual basis for what goes on. And even watching the show last night, there were one or two little things where I thought, we should have taken that out. There were little factoids that were slightly off that, kind of jump out at me. So my job was, as a consulting producer, was to try to be the shell answer man, as we used to say when I was a kid, which is to answer questions and just try to keep everybody with a strong factual underpinning. In other words, based on what we know and based on our understanding, we don't have complete access to FBI and Virginia State Police files. Without having those experts in the room, my job is to try to keep us on the straight and narrow in terms of here's what we believe the facts of the case to be. Probably just as important is to facilitate all those introductions to the people that would appear on camera or provide background to the investigators and to convince them. And I'll be frank as always, there's some begging, pleading, and cajoling in terms of people appearing on the show. Because you got to remember, for family members, and you see this even watching on camera, this is really difficult to talk about. For most of us, we're talking about the worst experience, maybe, or certainly close, greatest loss that most of us have ever survived. And then when you mix in just the general weirdness for most civilians of appearing on television, just like you were saying, Kristen, a minute ago. Here we go again, a stranger picking out your outfit, and in your case, doing your makeup, and you're surrounded by a number of people who are there with cameras and microphones and cables, whether they're messing up your home or they're doing it elsewhere. The whole experience is kind of odd.
It's a little surreal. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little outside most people's experience. Now, keep in mind, when you're watching a television show, there are 6 to a dozen people who are surrounding the person being interviewed, who are all there, doing their jobs. But it's very weird to try to focus on a conversation and reflect your point of view and offer information and answer questions without being terribly distracted by the fact that there's all these people, including sometimes a person with a microphone over your head on a boom, a couple of camera people and a director and a couple of producers. There's all this stuff going on, and you're trying to look at the person interviewing you, who is typically off camera, who's asking questions like, so Kristen, say this, do that. And unless, like you said, you're a trained actor, broadcaster, other professional who has developed those skill sets, it's kind of weird.
It was funny when I was watching one of our episodes this morning, and they had they gave me a line, but I remember being told to do that line 4 or 5 different times, do a different intonation, put more emphasis on this word. I remember thinking, this is so odd. Now, of course, with podcasting, I'm used to it, but it was really a surreal experience because it is just not something that most people are familiar with or used to. Yeah, but it was a very, very interesting experience. Now, you were there for most of the shoot. Correct?
Right. And so in my consulting producer role, where I've convinced many of these people, especially family members and former investigators and journalists, to participate, I would be typically off camera next to the director, sometimes with headphones on, so I could hear everything that was said and hear what the audio was sounding like going to camera, being recorded. What you're listening for are to make certain that we don't stray too far from the facts as we understand them. So this happened a lot where I'd hear a mistake, and then you wait because you can't just stand up and say, no, that's not it, because now you're distracting the poor person who's being interviewed, not to mention the interviewer, who's typically a producer just off camera. What you typically do is you wait until there's a break. There's always things they have to move around from a technical perspective, or they've got to change batteries in the cameras or whatever format they're recording it to. There's always little breaks. Then you turn to the director or the producer and you say, I know actually, they got the date wrong or whatever. And so they would say, let's go again. And this is where you get into that repeat stuff, Kristen, that you experienced. And I did too. I've done a fair amount of this stuff, but I did not aspire to be someone who appears in a television series. It's not central to how I define my life or even my role as a victim's advocate. I wasn't necessarily seeking this. Then, you make the correction. And then sometimes even midstream, they'd turn to me and they'd say, Bill, what's the name of the such and such? Or do you have the information on the date of this event or that event? And I'd either have it or I could look it up and then give them their answer. And, they used to tease me on set quite a bit about, Bill's the elephant that never forgets. And I was like, I don't know if I like the elephant analogy, although I like the animals. And so I'd be reaching out every single day for different family members and other people as potential guests, if you will, on the show. And by the way, most people who appear on the show don't get paid for what that's worth.
Yeah.
They are considered to be guests. This is considered to be newsworthy. So, for example, if you see a family member or other expert appear, they're doing it as a courtesy. So, you're asking people to take time out from their work or school or family life to come in and do this. And they do it because they think it's important. I really I can always identify with the family members because I'm a family member. Sure. And I know it's difficult. And, you can see it in their eyes and you can hear it in their voice. And I'm getting choked up talking about it now. I recognize that some of this is very difficult. And as I said, the additional pressure of being surrounded by strangers with boom mics and weird equipment, it puts you on edge. And that can be difficult.
I was watching episode 1 this morning, mm-hmm. and, one of the things, and you and I discussed this off mic earlier, one of the things that choked me up the most, I think, is watching the family member interviews.
Yes.
I have heard, doing it now, I've heard you talk about Kathy often enough at this point that there are times when I feel like maybe I'm immune to it. But I wasn't. I was getting choked up listening to you talk about Kathy.
Yeah.
And the photos, there were some photos on there that I had never seen before, and it hits you. And then listening to Ginny talk about Becky.
Yeah. Well, you can see Ginny, who's an absolutely wonderful person. She chokes up a bit. And in episode 2, Michael Knobling chokes up talking about his brother David. And, even though I've seen those clips, keeping in mind, I saw the show as it was edited. They'd talk about the cuts, putting the show together and all the different elements that go into it with our director, Buddy Day. Even though you've seen some of those things more than once, I still get choked up because it's very easy for, I think, any of us with a heart to understand how difficult this must be. And it don't just have to be the moms and the dads, but, they are amazing. And, it's sad. We've lost 8 of the 16 mothers and fathers in the Colonial Parkway murders because we've been waiting so long for answers. Half our parents, including both of mine, both of the Call parents, Mr. and Mrs. Call, are both gone. So that's happened in a number of the families. And so the siblings carry on. I think, anyone with half a heart would be able to understand how difficult this must be.
We are very much looking forward to starting our next step here on Mind Over Murder, and that is transitioning into a deep dive on the Colonial Parkway murders. We have a number of guests that we are very, very excited to bring you. Law enforcement experts, family members, people who appeared on the show, forensic experts. We have so many people that we are so excited to introduce to all of you as we deep dive into this case. So please know that you are going to get a ton of excellent content and coverage from us because we have so much about the case that is so important to share with you.
Our intention is to talk about a number of things that the real estate available in a show like Lover's Lane Murders, which is wonderful, it's still limited. And one of the great things about a podcast format is that we can be a little bit more open-ended. We can talk in a little bit more in-depth way. This is something that we hope to bring you over the coming weeks. We're probably going to try to go from a wide focus to a narrower focus. We will ultimately go through each one of the double homicides in the Colonial Parkway murders in an in-depth way. But to start with, we're going to be talking to some of our experts about the Colonial Parkway murders from a broader kind of macro view before we begin to narrow down into the individual incidents. We're also very open to answering questions, and you may hear your questions on the podcast. We very much encourage you to send us your thoughts. Tell us what you think about what we're doing with the podcast on the Mind Over Murder Facebook page and on the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page. Either one is fine. I guess we run both of them.
Yeah, we do. And we very much want this to be an enjoyable experience for our listeners, and we want to make sure that you are getting all of the information that you want. Understanding that there is some information we do not have available to us because we do not have access to case files. And understanding, of course, that there is a lot that we do not know just because we are not all-encompassing forensic experts, DNA experts, and law enforcement experts. But fortunately, we do have access to a lot of those. So we are going to try to provide you the best coverage that we possibly can, both from our perspective and from those of the guests that we're looking forward to bringing you.
We also have to be careful about something, and I mean this sincerely. Keep in mind, no one has ever been charged in the Colonial Parkway murders. Yep. I know there's a tendency on social media, and we've certainly seen plenty of questions to this effect. We cannot turn around and start saying we think so-and-so is involved in one or more of the Colonial Parkway murders. Right. We don't know that for sure. Now, we may try to finesse some of this because we're seeing it already. People are like, what about this person? What about that person? First of all, we don't want to get sued, and we also want to be fair to everyone involved. People's lives have been ruined by being accused of being involved in cases, many of which they have not been involved in. So we've seen any number of stories about people whose lives and reputations have been ruined. We are going to try to finesse this somewhat, and we'll work on that because we are going to do our best to answer questions. And I don't mind being somewhat provocative in talking about the Colonial Parkway murders. I want to see this conversation move forward. At the same time, we really have to be careful and fair to everybody. Yeah.
We understand that there are plenty of people who have followed this case for years who have their personal favorite suspects. We see a lot of that on social media. We see your comments, we hear your comments, we understand your comments. We may not agree with your comments, but we do understand that we're probably going to get treatises on a number of different people and why they are involved. Please understand that that's something we see you, we hear you, but we are not necessarily agreeing or disagreeing with you.
So with that, I think we're ready to wrap up.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Mind Over Murder. We look forward to talking to you again soon.
Join us again next time here on Mind Over Murder as we are joined by criminologist and crime scene reconstruction expert Laura Petler. You saw Laura on the Lover's Lane Murders television series. Now learn more about her work as a crime scene reconstruction expert and advocate for families across the country.
Is a production
next
of
time on
Zero
Mind Over Murder.
And Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristen Dilly.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.